We all know there's nothing Peter Parker likes better than making pop culture references, but there were tons of references to go around during Spider-Man Far From Home. We'll take a look at all the comic book references, hidden jokes, and Easter eggs we managed to spot during the latest Marvel movie. We'll explain why the name of Peter's Venice hotel was so important, and why Jake Gyllenhaal playing Mysterio is the perfect casting choice. In the beginning of Spider-Man Far From Home, we see Nick Fury and Maria Hill are investigating the aftermath of a devastating cyclone. Or at least we see two people who look like Nick Fury and Maria Hill investigating what looks like the aftermath of a devastating cyclone. They walk past a car with a license plate reading 463. The Earth Elemental bears a striking resemblance to the character Sandman, who debuted in the comic book Amazing Spider-Man No. 4, which was released in 1963. Although we know the Elemental is really just a trick played by Mysterio, we still appreciate this obscure comic book throwback reference.
I take people's nightmares and turn them into dream realities.
Let's look at another lesser-known inner joke about the film version of the Spider-Man franchise. We all know Tobey Maguire played Peter Parker in Sony's 2002 movie Spider-Man. But after sustaining an injury, he threatened to pull out of the sequel unless he received a massive increase in pay. Instead, the studio threatened to replace Maguire with Jake Gyllenhaal, and all of a sudden Maguire felt like getting back to work. So really, the fact that Gyllenhaal plays Quentin Beck, a villain who wants to take over for Spider-Man and pretend to be a hero, is pretty amazing.
I'm not even mad. That's amazing.
We especially love how much thought and care Mysterio put into his superhero costume, including making sure his cape stays perfectly wrinkle-free. There's nothing like being blipped out of existence and then having to return to high school to damage the old morale. Jason Iannello co-hosts the Midtown School of Science and Technology morning show with Betty Brant, and to say he's over it is an understatement. While he may not have been putting in his A-game on the school announcements, it's not surprising to those who are familiar with his comic book counterpart. In the comic books, Jason is a member of Flash Thompson's crew of popular kids who really have it out for Peter Parker. But while he likes to bully Peter, he is of course a massive fan of the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Brad Davis is another comic book character who appears to be quite different on the big screen. During Far From Home, he competes with Peter Parker for MJ's affections, and for a while he seems to be a serious contender. After all, he's tall, handsome, self-assured, and not trying to balance being a high school student with saving the world. In the comic books, Brad only shows up for a single issue, Amazing Spider-Man No. 188, but he does manage to score a date with Mary Jane. Peter and Mary Jane were on a break at the time and had a rather awkward run-in. But don't feel too badly for Peter, because it's not like he didn't see anyone while he and MJ were split up.
We were on a break!
During this time, he was seeing his Daily Bugle co-worker Betty Brant. Yep, the same character who dates Ned in the movie. In Far From Home, we saw Aunt May working for a charity called Homeless Support Food Shelter Hope. Happy Hogan, perhaps too happily, delivers an oversized check bearing the signature of none other than Tony Stark's widow, Pepper Potts. The charity is supposed to help those who have been displaced as a result of the blip. In the comic books, May Parker takes a job working for a similar charity called Food Emergency Aid, Shelter, and Training, otherwise known as FEAST. Of course, we're guessing Homeless Support isn't secretly a front for a criminal enterprise like FEAST was, but you never know. During the scene where Happy Hogan delivers the giant check to Aunt May, there's another Easter egg you might not have noticed. Behind Peter, you can see a small poster advertising a fight involving someone named Crusher Hogan. In the comic books, Peter Parker first used his astonishing new spider powers to compete in a wrestling match against a man named Crusher Hogan. Needless to say, this Hogan ended up getting crushed by Spider-Man in the ring. Another poster advertises a match between Crusher Hogan and Bonesaw McGraw. When Peter Parker's story was adapted for the 2002 Spider-Man movie, Crusher Hogan was renamed Bonesaw McGraw in order to avoid audiences confusing Crusher Hogan with real-life wrestler Hulk Hogan. Good move, brother! Of course, we assume Crusher Hogan, Happy Hogan, and Hulk Hogan aren't related, but it's kind of fun to imagine that they are. Peter may have entertained a brief wrestling career in the comic books, but that's not the only sport he's interested in. In the comic books, it was established that Peter and his Uncle Ben enjoyed going to see the Mets play together, and in Far From Home, we spotted a Mike Piazza jersey on display in Peter's room. Although we never got to meet Ben Parker in the MCU, it's nice to know that Peter has fond memories of him. Even the suitcase he packs for his trip bears the initials BFP after his Uncle Ben. There was actually going to be a scene in Homecoming where May gave some of Ben's old clothes to Peter, but it ended up being cut from the movie. For those of us who have ever witnessed or experienced a high school romance, the summer fling between Betty Brant and Ned Leeds hit a little too close to home. While it may have seemed to be pretty spontaneous, the two characters do hit it off in the comic books. As we mentioned earlier, Peter and Betty date, but Betty eventually grows frustrated by Peter's constant disappearances and calls it off. She goes on to marry Ned Leeds, who frankly doesn't have much in common with his comic book counterpart. Only time will tell if these MCU characters will go through the same on-again, off-again relationship they do in the comic books. On the class trip where Betty Brant and Ned Leeds fell in love with one another, they stayed at a hotel called Hotel de Mateus, an unpleasantly moist place located in beautiful Venice. The joke is that the hotel isn't quite a 5-star resort, but comic book fans might find the name de Mateus familiar. J.M. de Mateus is a comic book author who has been responsible for some great storylines about notable Marvel characters like Doctor Strange, Namor the Submariner, and of course, Spider-Man. He even wrote the infamous Kraven's Last Hunt storyline featuring one of Spider-Man's most popular villains, Kraven the Hunter. Could this Easter egg be a hint that we could see Kraven incorporated into the MCU? Well, probably not, but that's not going to stop us from hoping. We might have also been teased about another classic Spider-Man villain during the movie Far From Home. After Peter gets together with Talos masquerading as Nick Fury, he's introduced to an associate known simply as Dimitri. He might not be the most cheerful guy around, but he seems to get the job done until he pretty unceremoniously disappears and it turns out he was working with Quentin Back. In the comic books, the very first supervillain Peter fights is named Dmitri Smerdykov, also known as the Chameleon. He uses costumes and makeup in order to change his appearance to go undercover. In fact, Dmitri is also the half-brother of Sergei Kravenov, better known as Kraven the Hunter. Is Marvel Studios just dropping Easter eggs at this point, or are they giving us hints of villainous things to come? Although we now know the water elemental was just a trick perpetrated by Quentin Beck and his accomplices, he does resemble a real Spider-Man villain known as Hydro Man. In fact, when Betty and Ned are taking photos in Venice, you can see a boat which says ASM 212. This represents Amazing Spider-Man number 212, which features the debut of Hydro Man. There's also a scene where Flash Thompson talks about the rumored origin of this creature, which pretty closely mirrors the origin story of Maury Bench, the comic book Hydro Man. Spider-Man ended up sending him flying off his ship during the testing of an experimental generator. This left him with water-based superpowers and a grudge against Spider-Man. In the comics, Hydro Man and Sandman combined their powers into a creature called the Mud Thing, which might not be a great name, but it does look like what happened when the Elementals teamed up to attack the Tower Bridge. Marvel Comics have no shortage of awesome villains we'd like to see adapted to fit the big screen. Spider-Man in particular has an impressive rogue gallery, but you might be surprised to know it doesn't contain creatures known as Elementals. This group of characters is comprised of Hellfire, Hydron, Magnum, and Zephyr, and they've never been seen interacting with Spider-Man in any capacity. They're immortal beings who used to rule over all of Earth prior to the rise of Atlantis. But the Illusion Elementals in Far From Home look more like classic Spider-Man villains Molten Man, Hydro Man, Sandman, and Cyclone. During Spider-Man Far From Home, Peter Parker discovers his late mentor Tony Stark left him one last gift. And in true Tony Stark fashion, it's an incredibly dangerous gift he has no business putting in the hands of a high school student. It may look like an unfashionable pair of sunglasses, but it gives him access to an AI known as EDITH, which stands for Even Dead, I'm the Hero. Well, at least it's a better acronym than BARF. However, Agent Carter fans may recall a character named Edith Oberon who is romantically involved with Tony's father, Howard Stark. It might be a coincidence that two potentially dangerous beings were both named Edith, or it could be a big screen nod to a small screen series. We know we have to suspend our disbelief to enjoy Marvel movies, but sometimes they take things too far. Honestly, how could anyone think people would be fooled into thinking Spider-Man was another hero just because he was wearing a black costume instead of a red and blue one? It even had the same signature eye holes and everything. Clearly, MJ wasn't tricked by the appearance of Night Monkey even when Peter tried to explain away the webbing by saying maybe he's a spider monkey. But while that does seem crazy, it actually kind of happened in the comic book during the Marvel Apes miniseries. Yes, it's a real thing, and it's just about as crazy as it sounds. There's Spider Monkey, who has to work with the Ape Vengers who fight against Dr. Octopus. Dr. Octopus. Oh, that's good. During Spider-Man Far From Home, we saw Mysterio fool Peter Parker with a series of complex, over-the-top illusions. Obviously, this is done in the comic books as well, and one even involves a carnival similar to the one we saw in Far From Home. In Amazing Spider-Man number 67, Mysterio tricks Spider-Man into thinking he's been made fun-sized and trapped in a giant carnival where he's at risk of being squashed by Mysterio. See, sometimes it's not that much fun to be a spider. Many of the Far From Home visuals were reminiscent of this issue, including Mysterio's giant hand grabbing a tiny Spider-Man. In Amazing Spider-Man number 218 and 620, Mysterio utilizes drones and robots in a manner similar to the movie version of his character. While Quentin Beck certainly had it out for Tony Stark, he wasn't alone in wanting to besmirch his good name. He led a legion of disgruntled former Stark Industry employees, including one who looked very familiar. William Ginter Riva was in the very first Iron Man movie all the way back in 2008. He was the scientist who Obadiah Stane forced to create his Ironmonger suit and forced him to admit that he wasn't quite on Iron Man's level. If you didn't remember this guy, don't feel too badly. Peter Billingsley first appeared on the big screen in the role 11 years ago and was never mentioned until Far From Home. He currently holds the record for longest absence in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which is kind of a dubious honor. He also holds the honor of playing Ralphie from A Christmas Story. Whoa, really? No way! Confessing your feelings to someone can be difficult, but it's even more challenging when you're hiding a huge secret like being a superhero. When Peter tries to tell MJ how he feels about her, she claims to be confident that he's Spider-Man. But after he admits it, she says that she's really only about 67% sure. In the comic book Amazing Spider-Man Parallel Lives, there was a controversial storyline which revealed that Mary Jane had always known Peter was Spider-Man. Who knows Peter's secret and how long they've been aware has been a hot topic in the comic books, so it's not surprising this was reflected in the movie as well. We all know Quentin Beck is a bad guy, and we have ever since it was confirmed he would be in this movie. That's right, Marvel Studios, you may have fooled Peter Parker, but we knew Mysterio was going to be revealed as a villain at some point. But even for a bad guy, many felt he went way over the line during one specific hallucination. He caused Peter to believe he was in a cemetery near the grave of Tony Stark. We were also treated to a horrifying and heartbreaking Iron Man zombie, which was a pretty low blow. But in the Marvel Zombies series, many of our beloved superheroes did end up being infected with a zombie virus, and Iron Man is indeed one of them. Not only did we get to see the Skrulls back in action for the first time since Captain Marvel, but we heard mention of the Kree as well. Talos/Nick Fury mentions Kree sleeper cells, which certainly doesn't sound good. This could mean almost anything for the fate of the MCU, but it could have something to do with the Inhumans. In the comic books, the Kree take part in some rather inhumane experiments in an effort to create a genetically superior race. The Inhumans are human-like beings with incredible powers who eventually go on to form their own society. They were also the focus of an incredibly short-lived show, but maybe they'll be incorporated into the MCU at some point in the future. While Peter is incredibly awkward for most of Far From Home, MJ isn't exactly as cool as a cucumber herself. She even admits that she has a hard time getting close to people, but we know pretty much nothing about MJ's background at this point in time. In the comic books, Mary Jane has an abusive father which shapes her life in no small part. We know that the MCU MJ isn't the same as Mary Jane, but it's possible she has a similar sad backstory which could explain why it's hard for her to get close to people. Of course, there are tons of comic book references in Spider-Man Far From Home, but there were also nods to the popular Spider-Man video game for PlayStation 4. One of the features in the game is the ability to take selfies pretty much anywhere at any time. Hey, what more evidence do you need that this is a modern-day Spider-Man than being able to take selfies while swinging through the streets of New York? At the end of the movie, we got to see Peter taking selfies while displaying similar mannerisms and poses to his video game counterpart. MJ might not have been a fan, but we're guessing Spider-Man's other followers will be. It's safe to say that most people love the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, but J. Jonah Jameson is definitely not one of those people. He has always hated Spider-Man and views him as a dangerous vigilante. This character has been included in pretty much every adaptation of Spider-Man except for the MCU version up until this point. Not only did we finally get to see J. Jonah Jameson in the MCU, but he was portrayed by none other than actor J.K. Simmons, who also played the character in the Spider-Man franchise directed by Sam Raimi. While J. Jonah Jameson definitely hates Spider-Man, the feeling isn't mutual for the most part in the comics. While Peter Parker clearly has some philosophical differences with the man, he respects his right to his opinions and doesn't blame him for not approving of his extracurricular activities. In fact, while J. Jonah Jameson is out to get Spider-Man, he's often shown to be supportive of Peter Parker. In the comics, Jameson goes from the humble Daily Bugle to the sensationalist fake news network known as the Fact Channel. It's like the Marvel version of Alex Jones and his InfoWars, and this is the way he seems to be portrayed in Far From Home. Along with the big reveal of J. Jonah Jameson, we also learn that Mysterio's accomplices have put out the word that Spider-Man is secretly a villain. Footage emerges which seems to show Peter calling for the drone attack on the Tower Bridge, when in reality he was calling it off. This is actually one of Mysterio's oldest tricks, and he set up Spider-Man as a villain the very first time they met. He even managed to make Peter question whether or not he was a villain and had developed a multiple personality disorder. He even visits a psychiatrist to check out his mental health, but eventually realizes he's been fooled by Mysterio. When we saw the real Nick Fury aboard a spaceship filled with Skrulls, we naturally had a ton of questions. But if you haven't kept up with Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you might not have noticed that Fury's beach backdrop looked pretty familiar. It certainly seems like a reference to Project Tahiti, which was used to revive Agent Coulson after he perished during the attack on the helicarrier in the Avengers. Coulson ended up with some implanted memories of a beautiful beach in Tahiti, which he couldn't help but describe as a magical place whenever it was brought up. Well, these were just a few of the awesome hidden jokes, references, and Easter eggs packed into Spider-Man Far From Home. Fill us in on any we missed and tell us your favorite in the comment section below. Then click on the subscribe button to get access to the latest and greatest videos from us here at ScreenRant. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.